Addis Ababa, 2025, the hall froze. A man from Djibouti, new chair of the African Union, slammed his fist on the table, his words cracked like thunder: reparations, justice, dignity. Now, this wasn't diplomacy, it was defiance. And behind it burned the example of Ibrahim Traoré, the captain who showed Africa how to stand tall. The question, how long will the world ignore a debt carved from centuries of theft and blood? Stay, because this moment is not a headline, it's a rupture in history. At the African Union CARICOM Summit in Addis Ababa, September 2025, the new AU chairperson, Mahamoud Ali Yusuf of Djibouti, issued a demand that shook the room. He declared, former colonial powers must acknowledge their crimes, offer meaningful reparations, and dismantle structural injustices that still bind Africa and the Caribbean. The United Nations envoy echoed his call, warning that political independence did not free countries from structures of exploitation and that reparatory justice frameworks must now be put in place. This wasn't rhetoric, it was history pivoting. The old order quivered as Africa's voice rose louder than ever. The air in Addis Ababa was thick with expectation, but no one carried the weight of the moment more than Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. He had watched the AU chair pound the table, demand reparations, and expose the hypocrisy of the global order. Yet when the applause faded, all eyes drifted to him. For Traoré was no ordinary head of state. He was the one leader who had not only spoken against Western domination, but had acted expelling foreign troops, reclaiming mines, and forcing multinationals to renegotiate contracts. In the streets of Ouagadougou, his name was spoken with reverence. The soldier who turned his rifle into a shield for the people. Now, at this summit, his role became unavoidable. Whispers spread across delegations. Would Traoré throw his full weight behind the AU chair's radical declaration, or would he temper the fire, as so many before him had done, bowing to the unseen pressures of Washington, Paris, and Brussels? In his hotel suite that evening, Traoré paced before the window. Below him, Addis shimmered, its streets alive, with youth chanting for justice. His advisors urged caution. Excellency, if you go too far, sanctions will fall. Our economy cannot withstand another blockade. But Traoré knew that silence had a heavier price. He had seen the faces of miners in Burkina Faso, their hands raw, their children hungry, while cobalt and gold enriched foreign capitals. He had walked through villages, abandoned after debt-fueled austerity programs gutted hospitals and schools, and he had promised his people never again. He turned to his closest aide, his eyes sharp. If we do not speak now, when? If we do not demand justice here, then where? Our ancestors are watching, and our children are waiting. That night, as African leaders dined in glittering halls, Traoré drafted a response that would set the summit ablaze. It was not a policy paper, it was a declaration of war, not with weapons, but with truth. The morning sun poured into the Nelson Mandela Hall as leaders assembled for the second day of the summit. Cameras clicked, translators whispered, and anticipation rippled like a drumbeat. At the center sat Ibrahim Traoré, posture unyielding, his uniform a reminder that his path was not carved in ivory towers, but in the dust of Burkina Faso's villages. When the floor was opened, he rose slowly. The room fell quiet. My brothers, my sisters, he began, his voice steady but charged. We stand today, not as beggars of aid, but as heirs of a stolen inheritance. His words carried through the hall, deliberate and unflinching. The wealth that built the skyscrapers of Europe and the highways of America was torn from the soil of Africa. Yet our children still study in crumbling classrooms, our farmers still drink from poisoned wells, our nations still kneel beneath debt we never created. The hall trembled with murmurs. Some nodded in fierce agreement, others shifted uncomfortably. Traore Président, do we dare demand justice, or do we cling to crumbs while our people starve? Reparations are not a dream. They are the return of what was stolen, and if the West will not return it willingly, then we must reclaim it ourselves through unity, through sovereignty, through courage. Every phrase felt like a hammer striking iron. His gaze moved across the room. Presidents, ministers, generals, each forced to confront the blunt truth he had laid bare. Outside the hall, crowds erupted. Young Africans live-streamed his speech. Hashtags spread across Lagos. Accra, Nairobi, justice now. Traore speaks. But within, tension spiked. Diplomats scribbled notes. Western ambassadors shifted in their seats, already calculating their responses. One European envoy muttered to a colleague, "If he pushes this line, sanctions are inevitable." Traore knew it, yet he stood taller. His final words, a thunderclap. "We do not fear their punishments. We fear only betraying our ancestors and failing our descendants." The hall erupted, some in thunderous applause, others in cold silence. A storm had broken. The world was watching. The news of the AU's declaration did not drift quietly across the globe. It detonated. Within hours, Paris convened an emergency cabinet session. In London, the Foreign Office issued a statement calling the demands impractical and historically revisionist. Washington, behind closed doors, spoke more bluntly. If Traore and his bloc succeed, the floodgates of liability could drown the West. But in Ouagadougou, the mood was electric. Ibrahim Traoré was not merely a participant, he was the architect. His words had ignited the resolution, his steel conviction, pressing allies into alignment. Reparations, he had said in Addis, are not charity. They are repayment for stolen centuries. Crowds poured into the streets of Burkina Faso's capital, waving flags, chanting songs of defiance. Universities hosted midnight forums where students debated strategies. Legal tribunals in The Hague, financial claims filed against French banks, coordinated trade boycotts. If demands were ignored, a generation born into austerity was now speaking the language of restitution. In the press, Western outlets dismissed the fervor as political theater, but African and Caribbean journalists framed it differently. The chains are snapping. The heirs of empire must face their debt. Hashtags multiplied. Reparations now. Justice for Africa, spreading from Dakar to Kingston, from Accra to Port-au-Prince. Yet even as the drums of solidarity pounded, resistance mounted. French intelligence warned of economic retaliation. Think tanks in Washington published reports predicting irreversible fracture of global alliances, and quietly, lawyers for multinational corporations began drafting strategies to delay or dilute any reparations framework. Through it all, Traore remained unflinching. In a private council, he told advisors, "They will call us dreamers, they will call us radicals, but tomorrow, they will call us creditors." The battle was no longer abstract. The world had been given 48 hours to respond, and as the deadline loomed, one question pulsed through the streets of Ouagadougou. Would the West negotiate, or would it try to crush this rebellion of memory? The 48-hour mark became a drumbeat across Africa and the Caribbean. Radios ticked down the hours, and television anchors replayed Traoré's declaration like a prophecy. Reparations are repayment, not benevolence. Markets trembled. Investors whispered of capital flight, airlines braced for sanctions or sudden travel bans. In the Caribbean, leaders of Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad echoed Traoré's stance, demanding joint negotiations. In Ghana, a fiery parliamentarian rose and shouted, "They looted our gold, drained our soil, enslaved our people. Now they must pay, not with words, but with wealth." The chamber erupted in thunderous applause, but the louder Africa and the Caribbean spoke, the more hostile the Western capitals became. France threatened to suspend aid. Britain floated the idea of cutting trade preferences. In Washington, a senior official leaked to the press that economic coercion was on the table. The financial press called it a standoff between history and hegemony. Traore, however, was already 3 moves ahead. While Western leaders scrambled, he convened an emergency summit in Ouagadougou. Delegates from across the continent and Caribbean filed into a vast, unadorned hall. There were no chandeliers, no marble columns, only the raw determination of nations long silenced. Traore stood before them, his voice calm but burning. They believe threats will break us, but every embargo, every sanction, will reveal to the world their fear of justice. We will not beg. We will not yield. If they resist reparations, we will build our own financial order. His words weren't bluster. Draft charters circulated that night proposing an African-Caribbean reparations fund, seeded not with Western loans, but with regional resources and sovereign bonds. The idea was radical, defiant, and contagious. Meanwhile, in the streets, people carried clocks, painted on placards, their hands frozen at 48. The symbol, spread like wildfire, time had run out, and as the deadline approached, embassies in Ouagadougou tightened their security. Western diplomats whispered of evacuations, local cafes buzzed with rumors of mass boycotts. The world held its breath. The hourglass was almost empty. The 48th hour struck, and with it came silence. No reparations plan, no acknowledgement, no Western envoy at the table. Instead, the first answer came cloaked in the language of markets. The French Treasury announced it was reviewing all aid to Burkina Faso. British tabloids ran screaming headlines: Traore holds the West hostage. On Wall Street, analysts warned investors to pull back from African bonds. The message was clear: if Africa demanded reparations, it would pay in financial isolation. But the backlash did not stop at economic signals. Covert pressure began to mount. Reports surfaced of cyber intrusions targeting Burkina Faso's banks. A grain shipment scheduled from Europe was abruptly delayed. In Abidjan, whispers grew of French operatives stoking unrest to test Traore's hold on power. Inside Ouagadougou, the atmosphere hardened. Soldiers patrolled the capital with a vigilance not seen since the last coup. Crowds, however, did not cower. They surged. Chants of "our debt is paid in blood, now theirs must be in gold," rolled through the boulevards. Mothers carried children on their shoulders, shouting that they would never kneel again. Internationally, the media split into two worlds. Western anchors spoke of reckless nationalism, painting Traore as a dangerous ideologue, but African networks broadcast images of colonial archives, dusty ledgers listing stolen cotton, cocoa, diamonds. Caribbean radio hosts replayed recordings of elders recounting the chains of slavery. In those broadcasts, Traore was not a radical. He was an echo of unfinished history. The White House convened a classified session of the National Security Council. If this reparations movement solidifies, one advisor warned, "We are looking at a precedent that could bankrupt the West." A general replied, "Then it must be strangled in the crib." Meanwhile, Traore refused to blink. At a late-night press conference, he faced a barrage of international reporters. A BBC correspondent asked if he feared sanctions. Traore leaned forward and answered, "Sanctions? You already sanctioned us centuries ago. You sanctioned our dignity, or labor, our future. This time, you sanction yourselves by refusing justice." The words ricocheted across social media. Hashtags turned into rallies. In Kingston, tens of thousands marched to the British High Commission, demanding reparations. In Accra, students stormed lecture halls chanting, "Traore is right, the debt must be paid." Still, the backlash grew darker. Intelligence memos leaked of assassination plots, of bribes funneled to opposition leaders, of arms shipments moving quietly through West African ports. The empire was not retreating, it was preparing to strike back, and yet, the more it threatened, the more the reparations movement drew strength. The backlash became proof. If the demand was weak, why fear it? If the claim was baseless, why deploy armies of lawyers and spies? By the week's end, one thing was undeniable. This was no longer a debate about money. It was a confrontation over the soul of history itself. Would Africa's call for justice be buried under sanctions and sabotage, or would it become the spark that lit a global fire? The storm reached its peak when whispers of a secret meeting began to surface. Western leaders, shaken by the momentum Traore had ignited, gathered quietly in Brussels. The leaked agenda was chilling. Containment of reparations, agenda Burkina Faso case. Across Africa, rumors flew like wildfire. Sabotage was being planned. Leaders were being offered bribes, and plans for soft regime change were in motion. The intent was unmistakable: stop Traore before his movement spread beyond control. But something unexpected happened. At that very moment, documents declassified and damning emerged from archives in London and Paris. They revealed decades of deliberate underpayments to African nations for resources, secret ledgers showing manipulated gold transfers, and internal memos admitting that Africa's independence was nominal, not material. The leak, attributed to anonymous insiders, landed like a thunderclap. Suddenly, Traore was not simply demanding reparations, he was holding evidence, and not just evidence of theft, but proof of systematic fraud spanning generations. International journalists scrambled to verify the files. Within 48 hours, Le Monde, The Guardian, and even the New York Times confirmed their authenticity overnight. What the West had dismissed as ideological rhetoric became documented history. In Ouagadougou, Traore seized the moment. Standing before a crowd of tens of thousands, he raised a weathered folder of the leaked documents and declared, "They called us reckless. They called us dreamers. But here is their handwriting, their numbers, their confession. Reparations are not a demand. They are a debt." The crowd erupted. It was no longer a question of whether reparations were justified. The only question now was, what would the world do about it? The revelation did not remain in Ouagadougou. Screens from Lagos to Havana lit up with the leaked archives. Churches read them aloud in Sunday sermons. University halls in Dakar turned them into lectures. Caribbean activists waved the papers like banners in the streets of Port of Spain. For the first time, the reparations debate was not about emotion or memory, it was about receipts, numbers, contracts, confessions. The very architecture of colonial exploitation stood exposed in black ink. And then came the shock. No one anticipated. Several African central banks, coordinated quietly with Traore's team, announced that they were suspending payments on certain Eurobond debts until reparations talks began. It was not an empty threat. Billions were frozen overnight. Western capitals erupted in panic. Bond markets trembled. Analysts called it the unthinkable precedent. If Africa collectively chose this path, the financial system itself would quake. Yet amid the turmoil, something else unfolded. Leaders from Latin America, the Pacific, and even Southeast Asia sent delegations to Ouagadougou. They wanted to study Traore's stance, to align their own historic claims with his cause. Suddenly, Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation long dismissed as peripheral, had become the gravitational center of a new world order. International cameras turned back to Traore. At a packed press conference, he uttered the words that sealed his status as an icon. "They thought we were asking for charity. No, we are demanding justice. We will not beg for what is already ours." Those words did not simply resonate, they detonated across continents. Chants of justice, not charity, echoed in protest squares. Ibrahim Traoré was no longer just the president of Burkina Faso, he had become the unlikely face of a global reckoning. From the dust of struggle rose a new horizon. In Burkina Faso, schools once abandoned now thrived with books printed in local languages. Farmers, no longer chained to predatory contracts, shared harvests that actually fed their children first. And in the capital, a monument was raised not to war, but to dignity reclaimed. The ripple spread beyond borders. In Jamaica, reparations committees invoked Traoré's stance to demand formal talks with London. In Namibia, survivors of colonial massacres saw their petitions finally reach international courts. Africa was no longer pleading. It was teaching the world how to stand. Before the African Union, Ibrahim Traoré delivered his final words in a voice both steady and unyielding. "We did not ask for permission to be free. We stood up to win it. And in standing, we remind the world, justice delayed is justice denied." The chamber erupted not in applause alone, but in resolve. Nations once scattered by history now felt gathered by destiny. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré touches your heart, share this story. Subscribe to the channel to follow an Africa that will never again bow its head. God bless Africa.